I'd like to talk today about the power of writing. And the reason that I'm going to start with that as a topic is because we often find ourselves, as you mentioned, trying to convince others that writing has a power that makes it paramount in terms of teaching it in school. I want to be really frank, though. Writing is really a difficult topic in the sense of both teaching and also doing. And, you know, if you talk to professional writers, they also kind of emphasize this. And a couple of my favorite quotes, writing is easy. All you have to do is sit down at a typewriter and open an empty vein. Now, you know, this is from a professional writer, somebody who writes all the time. Even sometimes when we take things that, you know, we think when we look at them as being pretty simple, something like The Cat in the Hat, written by Dr. Seuss. When he talked about writing this, it took him a year to write this simple book. And one of the things that he said was that every sentence for him was like a pang of birth. He rewrote, he wrote, he rewrote again, he thought about it. But a year to write The Cat in the Hat, it almost seems impossible that it would take that long. We often interview young children, you know, kids that are 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age, to talk to them about writing. And in one of these interviews, we asked a kid, you know, what would they like to be? And they shot back, I'd like to be an author, but you have to be dead. Now, of course, writing's not quite that difficult. Many kids master it quite well, and many adults are quite good writers. In terms of thinking about why writing's powerful, in another interview that we did with kids, we had a child tell us, and this is kind of a modern view, I guess, on writing, the pen is mightier than the sword, a kind of famous saying. The period about to end this sentence, for one thing, has zillions of unexploded atoms in it. Now, of course, you know, that's not the way we typically think about writing, but I particularly like that because what the kid was trying to do is to say, you know, writing's really a powerful thing for himself and also for others. And I want to illustrate this with another example of this. I saw this actually in operation. There was a sign that was in a building that said, "Alarm will sound if opened." Now, this piece of writing had basically no impact on people who saw it because they knew that the alarm would not sound. So they were going in and out of that door all the time. This happened to be in a building that I worked. And one of the enterprising secretaries decided to put the next sign on it, wet paint, and people stopped going out of that because you could imagine they were thinking, I'm going to push up against this. Now, even though I'm making a non-empirical case about the power of writing at this point, I want to be really frank. And I'm using data from the US, but when I've been in Europe, which has been quite often recently, talking with other scholars, I think it's probably a pretty similar situation. I suspect it's the same in Denmark, but given that Denmark's not the country that I know best, I'll leave that to you to judge. What we see in the US is that at school, students spend very, very little time writing. So we've done surveys with teachers from 6 years old teaching kids all the way to the end of high school, which in the US is 18 years of age. And when we ask them about the writing that kids do at school, it's amazing how little it is. So the best time for writing, and this is going to seem crazy, but is when you're 6 to 9 in the US. Kids spend about 20 minutes a day writing and about a total hour of writing and writing instruction. So everything together. When we move into kids being from about, say, 9 to 12, what happens is the writing goes up by a whole 5 minutes during a full school day to about 25 minutes, but the amount of time total spent on instruction drops to 15 minutes a day. It's as if kids already know everything they need to know about writing. And I doubt seriously that that's the case when you're 9, 10, 11, or 12 years of age. When we take a look at kids as they move into adolescence, from about 13 to 18, kids write in the US but rarely is it a paragraph length or longer. Most of the writing that are done by kids, the number one thing in school is filling in the blanks. You know, they'll give something, they'll have something that they need to write in, a word or two. The second most common activity is making a list of things. The third most common activity, nothing wrong with this activity, and maybe nothing wrong with the other activities if they weren't the primary things, is writing a one-sentence answer to a homework question. And then the fourth most common thing, both for middle school kids and for high schoolers in the U.S., is writing a sentence or two about a paragraph or something that they've read. But what you're not seeing there is extended writing. They're not analyzing to persuade. They're not really analyzing to inform. You know, in a sense, what they're basically doing is writing to provide an answer to something, for the most part. Another thing, and I really mentioned this already, is that we don't see much instruction in writing. If there's very little writing, it's not really that surprising that kids are not taught to write that much. And, you know, when we take a look at asking teachers about using evidence-based practices, and by those, I mean practices that have some evidence that they work, not just from a single study, but from multiple studies, they use those, but we don't see them in play very often. I mean, it's kind of like, I'll do this once every 3 weeks, or once every 2 months. And so even for English teachers in the U.S. who are the primary teachers of writing, what they tend to do is they tend to teach literacy in middle school and high school. That's what they're interested in, reading and obviously not writing in this case. And I think one of the reasons for this is also when we ask teachers, and I have no idea if this is the same thing in Denmark, but we asked them, how prepared do you feel to teach writing? And we ask about their university preparation, we ask about their school preparation, and we ask about their personal preparation. And what they tell us, 1 out of every 2 teachers say, unprepared. I'm not sure how to do this. And typically when I ask teachers if they like to write, or if they like to teach writing, only about 1 out of every 3 teachers indicate this is something that they enjoy doing. So it's not really that surprising that we don't see a lot of writing and writing instruction going on. If you don't feel comfortable teaching it, if you don't particularly like it, unless somebody's forcing you to do it, you're unlikely to engage in it. Now, I want to spend a little bit of time going beyond, you know, the zillions of atoms in a sentence, or I'd like to be an author, but you have to be dead kind of thing, to make the case for why writing is important. I think the first way of doing this is a non-empirical way, and that is just to talk about all the different things that we use writing for. And it's an amazing list. You know, initially writing started out as cuneiforms that we used to record information, often about how many sheep we might have or other kinds of things. Fairly quickly, it started to move to a way that we could record and gather information beyond that simple stuff. And the great thing about that is think of all the things that you read that give you directions for doing things. You get a new refrigerator, you get a new telephone, invariably there's something you're going to have to read that was written by a technical writer that conveys the information that you need. You know, probably the most common way that we use writing right now, and it's exploded for kids and also for adults, is for communication purposes. We tweet, we email, we blog. There's more writing taking place now than any time that I can ever remember in about a 35-year career as an academic. It's unbelievable. Now, kids don't talk about that as if they're writing, because they think about writing as something that you do at school that's academic in nature. But communication and writing tools are everywhere now, and obviously we'd like to parlay that into something that we can apply at school. I came across a quote a number of years ago I really liked by Stephen King, who's the horror novelist in the U.S., not a writer to everybody's taste, but I love this quote. He said, "I have the heart of a child," and then he went on to say, "I keep it at home in a jar." And you know, for him, it was his playful way of talking about creating imaginary worlds. You know, kind of the child within him that created stuff for others to enjoy. Now, his is a little creepy and a little on the edge, but you know, the other way that we use writing is to express ourselves creatively, creating imaginary worlds, sometimes for ourselves and sometimes to share with others. Also, writing can foster a sense of heritage and purpose. The Chinese dynasties often came together in part because of a written symbol system that provided them with a unity for conveying information across large spaces and time. And another way is obviously to transmit information. Now, writing can also be used in other ways that we may not think about. And one of those is we use it for psychological purposes. You know, one of the things that's been done in places where there may be strife or tension with kids is to have them write about things. So in Israel, for example, for kids living in a kibbutz, they spent a good bit of time writing about what was going on around them, which for many of us would not be our common thing, because this was at a point that there was a lot of tension and a lot of fighting around them. And so what that ended up doing was relieving stress. And so one of the ways of thinking about writing is when we write about our personal problems, it has both a physiological and a psychological effect. And there's pretty strong evidence to this case that it can have a curative power in the sense of thinking about using it in that sense. So one of the things that you'll sometimes see that psychologists and psychiatrists use is having people keep a journal about their daily events. One, it's to find out what's happening, and second, it's because it's a way of reducing anxiety. Another way that we use writing, and all of us probably in this room have done this at times, is to explore who we are and to think about what we do. You know, think about diaries that many young kids keep early on to record their experiences and to think about the problems that they do. One of the most important ways of thinking about writing is this incredible tool for persuading others. Every time you pick up a newspaper and you look at the editorial section, somebody's trying to convince you of a particular point of view. And you may be doing the same thing when you write to others. We use this to chronicle our experiences, as we've already mentioned. And at least for school, one of my favorite quotes is by E.M. Forster, a very famous writer, who said, "How can I know what I think until I see what I say?" And so the basic idea here is that writing is a powerful tool for helping us explore what we know, and I would also say and argue for transforming what we know as well. Now, the other way I want you to think about why writing's important today is that when we take a look in industrialized countries like Denmark, what we see is that writing has become a gateway tool into, I'm going to call these white-collar jobs. In the U.S., what white-collar jobs mean are jobs where you do a lot of thinking. They're not manual labor jobs per se, but they're intellectual jobs. What we see is for jobs like this, when we ask employers about the importance of writing, 85% say it's a gateway into the job. People who have good writing skills are more likely to get these jobs, which pay a higher wage. And also, usually in the U.S., this may not be a problem here, but it's an important issue in the U.S., also pay health insurance. And it's also an important aspect in terms of advancement in your career. What was surprising to us is that in blue-collar jobs, being a plumber, being an electrician, being a mechanic, it's also become essential. 80% of blue-collar workers say now that writing's important to their job. Now, it's not as central. Notice I didn't say it was a gateway into their jobs, but it is very important to success. And let me give you a kind of practical example of this. My father was a mechanic. He did not graduate from high school in the U.S. Great mechanic, though, you know, really good mechanical mind. Towards the end of his career in working, he had a garage for a while. He moved away from that because the literacy demands became so large. Cars moved to being electronic in terms of a lot of their systems. It meant you had to be a good reader And also in terms of the schools that you now had to go to, you had to be able to demonstrate that ability in terms of your writing. Another way of thinking about writing when we're thinking about kids as they move through school versus the university is that when they hit the universities now, writing also has become more and more critical. So one of the things that's emphasized in the U.S. And the movement now is to try to reformulate instruction in K through 12, 6 to 18 years of age, so that kids are college ready. Because many kids in the U.S. do not go to school being college ready. Writing has taken on a particularly important role in this. And one of the reasons why is professors like myself say that 1 out of every 2 kids that come to college are not ready for the literacy demands for both reading and also for writing. And so you have to ask yourself, what is it that college kids need to be able to do to be successful in college? And the kinds of analysis that we take a look at suggest 3 things. You need to be able to read material in your content class, analyze it, and interpret it in writing, because that's the way you often demonstrate your knowledge to professors. Second, you have to be able to persuade, because often you'll be given something, you know, like in for example, a class that might be about international law. It might ask you to analyze a treaty, say the U.S. and British Fishery Act, and make an argument for one side or the other. And you have to make a persuasion for that. And then a really common task is you need to be able to summarize information written, both in notes and in written text form as well. Those seem to be the 3 critical skills. And if you think about what I said earlier about kind of the instruction end and the types of writing kids do, there's a complete mismatch between what kids do in school, at least in the U.S., and what they're expected to do to be college ready and be successful in college. And obviously that's not a good situation for kids, because it puts them in a place where they're not bringing with them the tools that they most need. Now, I'm going to start moving a little bit into the evidence-based and this issue about using writing as a tool for learning and reading. But I do want to point out something to you. At least in the U.S., you know, one of the things that I said is that we don't see kids writing a lot. But when we look at the way that they're tested, when they move into middle school and high school, into adolescence, writing is often used as a way of demonstrating that you've mastered or you know something. And so I want to make a point here is that the better you write, the more likely you're to be successful. And I want to kind of illustrate this in a really kind of fundamental way, thinking about 4 skills that you might not think of when you think of composing. You know, these are fundamental skills to writing. So I want you to imagine for a second that I ask all of you to write a paper. And let's just say that there's 100 of you. And I ask you to write on the same topic, kind of that boring Fishery Act thing that I just mentioned earlier. And then I worked with another set of teachers to rank order those from lowest in quality to highest, 1 to 100, in terms of quality of ideas. So whichever one of you had the best ideas on the Fishery Trade Act in terms of persuasive text, that would be number 100. If I took the paper that was right in the middle, number 50, okay, and then I asked somebody to rewrite it in terms of handwriting, so it was difficult to read. I'm not changing a word, but it's not as legible. And then I asked somebody else to write it, same paper, where it is easily readable, very legible. Again, I've changed no word. If I take those papers, or your paper, put it back in the stack with the 2 versions, it's going to be amazing when I ask other people to score this. Again, I want to reiterate, I've not changed a single word. So if your handwriting was poor in this case, you drop down all the way to number 15 from 50. Or you go all the way up to number 85 if you had the really legible one. Now, if I did the same thing with spelling or grammar errors, no spelling or grammar errors, and about 5 spelling or grammar errors, then you can see for spelling, I drop down to paper number 35, or I go up to paper number 65, or for grammar, 29 and 71. Now, you think about that, that's incredible. I haven't changed a word. Your argument is still the same. And these very fundamental or basic writing skills, people make judgments about what you say. They see grammar errors, they see sloppy writing, they see spelling errors. They don't think as much of your ideas. Now, the counter to this on your part is to say, hey, we're using word processing. You know, less spelling errors, no problem in terms of handwriting because you have print. And, you know, maybe a grammar checker will help you be a little bit better on your grammar. There's a really kind of interesting thing that happens when we look at this. So if we take the same paper with the same number of errors, and we have a typed version from a word processed one and a handwriting version, you as teachers are likely to be much more critical of the typed version than you are of the handwritten version. So there's kind of the opposite effect going on. So the typed version drops with some errors in it to number 31, or if it's handwritten with the same number of errors, it goes up to number 68 or so, which, you know, in some ways when I first saw these findings, I thought that just doesn't make sense. But when people started asking the raters questions, it was because of this issue around being more critical. We do not expect to see errors in typewritten papers. We expect those to be, you know, close to perfect at the point that we're evaluating. So you can see where these kind of, you know, very basic mechanical issues in writing, which are usually taught to very young kids, if they're taught at all, can have a profound influence later on in terms of your success in classrooms, or your success in college, or in terms of the ideas that you present at work in written form. Now, one of the things that we've been in the process of doing, we've had a number of reports with the Carnegie Institution. I'm going to mention the three of these. You can find these online really easily. Writing Next was the first, Writing to Read was the second, and Informing Writing About Assessment was the third. Now, I want to give a little backdrop on this. One of the things that we were worried about, and we worked with the Carnegie Corporation in New York on, is why writing, given all the things I've said so far, wasn't more in play in the reform movement in the U.S. Because we're constantly in a reform mind in the U.S. about schools, because we've been unhappy with our schooling ever since I can remember. Kids are not doing as well, at least in somebody's mind, as we think they should be. Whether that's the case or not can be debated. But regardless, we're constantly talking about reform, and writing is the left-out player in the U.S. It's not central to it. Reading is, and it should be. Mathematics is, and it should be. Science is, and it should be. But writing is the left-out partner. And so we ask ourselves, why is that the case? Well, we thought there's probably three reasons. One is that, you know, educators and policymakers may not see that writing is important, that beyond itself, you know, all the things we talked about in terms of persuasion, et cetera, it doesn't make a difference, you know, to other aspects of schooling. The second may be is that we don't think, or policymakers don't think, that we know how to teach writing. And then the third is we don't know how to assess writing. And that's particularly important in the US context because we're so crazy about tests. You know, we test everything, and whatever we test, if we don't test it, it doesn't exist because it doesn't get taught. Now, you know, that sounds crazy, but that's the context within which I work. So I want to address the first one, and I want to address it in the same way that we've been talking about those kind of basic skills, and we'll be doing this a little bit later when we talk about evidence-based practices. And that is, you know, that idea of 100 people writing something or taking something, and what kind of percentile jump you make. And so we'll always have as our vantage point, we'll think of the average kid right dead in the middle at 50, and we'll see how far something jumps up or jumps down as a result. So when you have kids write about stuff that they're learning in science, social studies, or mathematics, what happens is the kid who might score on a test as number 50 jumps up to about number 59. Now, you could say that's not a huge jump, but the great thing about this is it's a consistent jump. Kids can improve how well they're doing, where they set, by writing about the stuff that they're studying, in class or outside of it. Now, probably more important than that is that if you have content material and you read about it, and then you write something, a summary, you take notes, you write questions about it and answer it, or even more importantly, you do an extended writing piece on it, what we see is that kids who write about that on norm reference tests, it's really hard to get kids to jump on norm reference tests. What we see is they jump from the 50th to the 66th slot, or if it's researcher design comprehension measures, they jump all the way up to number 70. In addition, if you teach writing, so in this case we were talking before, if kids write about something they read or they study, their comprehension and learning becomes stronger. The really nice thing is, if you teach writing, their reading gets better as well. So what we find, three things here. One, if you teach kids about the structure of text as they write, you teach kids the process of writing in terms of the kinds of strategies that you use, or you have kids just write. What we see is that reading comprehension improves. Now, we've not taught any reading in this case. We've just simply taught kind of the higher level processes of writing, and we see a corresponding jump in terms of reading. Also, when we teach things like sentence combining, how to put two simpler sentences together to form a more complex one, we see a jump in terms of reading fluency. And probably what happens here is that as we teach these sentence skills, putting these smaller sentences into more complex ones, kids become more fluent in terms of their ability to recognize those structures as they read, and it has a positive effect in terms of improving their fluency at reading text, and there's a pretty good relationship between fluency and comprehension. And then finally, when we teach kids spelling, one of the things that we see is we see a very strong jump in their word reading skills. So we've not taught reading in this case, all we've done is writing, and we see improvements in terms of how well kids read. Now, the other 2 points that I made was about, can we teach writing? And so here's the nice thing. We can, and what we found about 15 or 20 different techniques that improve the overall quality of writing. Also, we found that when teachers assess writing, or kids assess their own writing, or peers give feedback on writing, students' performance improves as well. Thank you guys very much.